Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And sorry about the glare. And we're going to read chapter 6, and this will be part 1 today. Okay, I hope you guys are enjoying the reading so far. I know I am. Okay, here we go. Oh, let me move in just a little bit here. Oh, the other way. Okay. All right. Chapter 6, Building the New World Order. The game called Bailout, re-examined and shown to be far more than merely a means of getting taxpayers to foot the cost of bad loans. The final play revealed as the merger of all nations into world government, the unfolding of that strategy as applied to Panama, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, China, Eastern Europe, and Russia. Let us return now to the game called Bailout. Everything in the previous chapter has been merely background information to understand the game as it is played in the international arena. Here, finally, are the rules. Number 1, commercial banks in the industrialized nations, backed by their respective central banks, create money out of nothing and lend it to the governments of underdeveloped nations. They know that these are risky loans, so they charge an interest rate that is high enough to compensate. It is more than what they expect to receive in the long run. Number 2, when the underdeveloped nations cannot pay the interest on their loans, the IMF and World Bank enter the game as both players and referees. Using additional money created out of nothing by the central banks of their member nations, they advance development loans to the governments, which now have enough to pay the interest on the original loans with enough left over for their own political purposes. Number 3, the recipient country quickly exhausts the new supply of money, and the play returns to point number 2. This time, however, the new loans are guaranteed by the World Bank and the central banks of the industrialized nations. Now that the risk of default is removed, the commercial banks agree to reduce the interest Oops, sorry. Sorry about that. A little squirrel there with the Zoom thingy. Let me see here. Let me reread that again. Okay, so the commercial banks agreed to reduce the interest to the point anticipated at the beginning. The debtor governments resume payments. Number 4, the final play is, well, in this version of the game, there appears to be no final play because the plan is to keep the game going forever. To make that possible, certain things must happen that are very final indeed. They include the conversion of the IMF into a world central bank as Keynes had planned, which then issues an international fiat money. Once that bank of issue is in place, the IMF can collect unlimited resources from the citizens of the world through the hidden tax called inflation. The money stream then can be sustained indefinitely, with or without the approval of the separate nations, because they will no longer have money of their own. Since this game results in a hemorrhage of wealth from the industrialized nations, their economies are doomed to be brought down further and further, a process that has been going on since Bretton Woods. The result will be a severe lowering of their living standards and their demise as independent nations. The hidden reality behind so-called development loans is that America and other industrialized nations are being subverted by that process. That is not an accident. It is the essence of the plan. A strong nation is not likely to surrender its sovereignty. For those who are listening, I just wanted to read the emphasized sentence. That is not an accident. It is the essence of the plan. So it's not organic. It's not by chance. It's not by accident. It is by design. Wow, that's incredible. A strong nation is not likely to surrender its sovereignty. That is true. Americans would not agree to turn over their monetary system, their military, or their courts to a world body made up of governments which have been despotic to their own people, especially since most of those regimes have already revealed anti-American hostility. But if Americans can be brought to the point where they are suffering from a collapse of their economy and from a breakdown in civil disorder, things will be different. Then, when they stand in bread lines and face anarchy in their streets, they will be more willing to give up sovereignty in return for assistance from the World Bank and the UN peacekeeping forces. This will become even more acceptable if a structured demise of communism can be arranged ahead of time to make it appear that the world's major political systems have converged into the common denominator of social democracy. It's like boiling the frog slowly, right? It's an analogy I hear a lot. The final play, the underdeveloped nations, on the other hand, are not being raised up. What is happening to them is that their political leaders are becoming addicted to the IMF cash flow and will be unable to break the habit. These countries are being conquered by money instead of arms. Soon they will no longer be truly independent nations. They are becoming mere components in this. Excuse me, got a little burp there. They are becoming mere components in the system of world socialism planned by Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes. Their leaders are being groomed to become potentates. Oh, that's a new word for me. They're being groomed to become potentates in a new high-tech feudalism, paying homage to their lords in New York. And they are eager to do it in return for privilege and power within the New World Order. That is the final play. The essence of socialism is redistribution of the wealth. The goal is equality, and that means taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Sounds like Robin Hood in a bad way, right? At least that's the theory. Unfortunately, the poor are never benefited by this maneuver. They either do not get the money in the first place, too much is siphoned off by the bureaucracies which administer the programs, or if they do get any of it, they don't know what to do with it. They merely spend it until it is gone, and then no one has the money, except, of course, those who administer the government programs. Nevertheless, politicians know that promises to redistribute the wealth are popular among two groups: the voters who naively believe it will help the poor, and the socialist managers who see it as job security. Supported by these two voting blocs, election to office is assured. One of the early American advocates of socialism on a global scale, including the draining of wealth away from the rich United States, was John F. Kennedy. He undoubtedly learned the concept while attending the Fabian London School of Economics in 1935 to 36, just prior to his father's appointment as ambassador to England. And that was from Martin, page 25. When JFK became president, his political views continued to carry the imprint of that training. In September of 1963, he addressed the finance ministers and central bank governors from 102 nations at that annual meeting of the IMF World Bank. He explained the concept of world socialism in glowing terms. 20 years ago, when the architects of these institutions met to design an international banking structure, the economic life of the world was polarized in overwhelming and even alarming measure on the United States. 60% of the gold reserves of the world were here in the United States. There was a need for redistribution of the financial resources of the world, and there was an equal need to organize a flow of capital to the impoverished countries of the world. All this has come about. It did not come about by chance, but by conscious and deliberate and responsible planning. Responsible planning, that's an interesting word that he used. And this was from the text of Kennedy's speech to World Monetary Parley. New York Times, October 1st, 1963, page 16. Sorry for the toggling. It's a very thick book. Okay, anyways. CFR sets strategy. The brain trust for implementing the Fabian Plan in America is called the Council in Foreign Relations, CFR. We shall look at it closely in future chapters, but it is important to know at this point that almost all of America's leadership has come from this small group. That includes our presidents and their advisors, cabinet members, ambassadors, board members of the Federal Reserve System, directors of the largest banks and investment houses, presidents of universities, and heads of metropolitan newspapers, news services, and TV networks. And that was from, here's a footnote, for an in-depth analysis of the CFR, including a comprehensive list of members, see James Perloff, Shadows of Power, Appleton, Wisconsin, Western Islands, 1988. It is not an exaggeration to describe this group as the hidden government of the United States, or shadow government, right? There was another term for it. CFR members have never been shy about calling for the weakening of America as a necessary step toward the greater good of building world government. One of the CFR founders was John Foster Dulles, who later was appointed Secretary of State by CFR member Dwight Eisenhower. In 1939, Dulles said, "Some delusion or leveling off of the sovereignty system as it prevails in the world today must take place to the immediate disadvantage of those nations which now possess the preponderance of power. The establishment of a common money would deprive our government of exclusive control over a national money. The United States must be prepared to make sacrifices afterward in setting up a world political, economic order which would level off inequalities of economic opportunity with respect to nations." And that quote was from Dulles Outlines World Peace Plan, New York Times, October 28, 1939. CFR member Zbigniew Brzezinski was the national security advisor to CFR member Jimmy Carter. In 1970, Brzezinski wrote, "Some international cooperation has already been achieved, but further progress will require greater American sacrifices. More intensive efforts to shape a new world monetary structure will have to be undertaken, with some consequent risk to the present relatively favorable American position." And that was from Zbigniew Brzezinski, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, Westport, Connecticut, Greenwood Press, 1970, page 300. At the spring of 1983 Economic Summit in Williamsburg, Virginia, President Ronald Reagan declared, "National economics need monetary coordination mechanics, and that is why an integrated world economy needs a common monetary standard. But no standard but no national currency will do. Only a world currency will work. The CFR strategy for convergence of the world's monetary systems was spelled out by Harvard professor Richard N. Cooper, a CFR member who had been the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs in the Carter administration. I suggest a radical alternative scheme for the next century: the creation of a common currency for all of the industrial democracies with a common monetary policy and with a joint bank of issue to determine that monetary policy. How can independent states accomplish that? They need to turn over the determination of monetary policy to a supranational body. Emphasis in original. And the emphasis was the quote, the creation of common currency for all of the industrial democracies with a common monetary policy and a joint bank of issue to determine that monetary policy. That was the italicized emphasis. For those who are just listening, anyways, it is highly doubtful whether the American public, to take just one example, could ever accept that countries with oppressive autocratic regimes should vote on the monetary policy that would affect monetary conditions in the United States. For such a bold step to work at all, it presupposes a certain convergence of political values. That quote was from A Monetary System for the Future by Richard N. Cooper, Foreign Affairs, Fall 1984, page 166, 177, and 184. Phrases such as monetary coordination mechanisms, modern world economic order, convergence of political values, or new world order are not very specific. I remember hearing the phrase new world order from Papa Bush Sr. in one of his speeches. Yet to the insiders, to the average person, they sound pleasant and harmless. Yet to the insiders of the club, there are code phrases which have a specific meaning: the termination of national sovereignty and the creation of world government. CFR member Richard Gardner, another advisor to President Carter, explains the meaning of these phrases and also calls for the Fabian strategy of deception and gradualism. In short, the house of world order will have to be built from the bottom up, an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault. And that quote was from The Hard Road to World Order by Richard Gardner, Foreign Affairs, April 1974, page 558. As for the programmed decline of the American economy, CFR member Samuel Huntington argues that if higher education is considered to be desirable for the general population, a program is then necessary to lower the job expectations of those who receive a college education. And that quote was from Michael Crozier, Samuel P. Huntington, and Joji Watanuki. The Crisis of Democracy, New York University Press, 1975, page 183 and 184. CFR member Paul Volcker, former chairman of the Federal Reserve, says the standard of living of the average American has to decline. I don't think you can escape that. And that quote was from Volcker asserts U.S. must trim living standard. New York Times, October 18, 1979, page 1. In 1993, Volcker had become the U.S. chairman of the Trilateral Commission. The TLC I was thinking TLC, like tender loving care. But that's the opposite here, isn't it? Trilateral Commission. The TLC was created by David Rockefeller to coordinate the building of the New World Order in accordance with the Gardner Strategy, an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. The objective is to draw the United States, Mexico, Canada, Japan, and Western Europe into political and economic union. Under slogans such as free trade and environmental protection, each nation is to surrender its sovereignty piece by piece until a full-blown regional government emerges from the process. The new government will control each nation's working conditions, wages, and taxes. Once that has happened, it will be a relatively simple step to merge the regionals into global government. That is the reality behind the so-called trade treaties within the European Union, EU, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Agreement, APEC, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. They have little to do with trade. In the Trilateral Commission's annual report for 1993, Volcker explains, interdependence is driving our countries toward convergence in areas once considered fully within the domestic purview. Some of these areas involve government regulatory policies, such as environmental standards, the fair treatment of workers, and taxation. And that quote was from Washington, 1993, the annual meeting of the Trilateral Commission, Trialogue 46, New York Trilateral Commission, 1993, page 77. In 1992, the Trilateral Commission released a report co-authored by Toyu Gyoten, a chairman of the board of the Bank of Tokyo and formerly Japan's Minister of Finance for International Affairs. Gyoten had been a Fulbright scholar who was trained at Princeton and taught at Harvard Business School. He also had been in charge of the Japan desk of the International Monetary Fund. In short, he represents the Japanese monetary interests within the New World Order. In this report, Gyoten explains that the real importance of trade agreements is not trade, but the building of global government. Regional trade arrangements should not be regarded as ends in themselves, but as supplements to global liberalization. Regional arrangements provide models for building blocks or for increased or strengthened globalism. Western Europe, the EU, represents regionalism in its truest form. The steps toward deepening, increasing the number of agreements are dramatic and designed to be irreversible. A common currency, central bank, court, and parliament will have expanded powers. After the Maastricht summit, the Dutch town where the meeting was held, an economist editorial pronounced the verdict. Call it what you will, by any other name, it is federal government. In sum, the regional integration process in Europe can be seen as akin to an exercise in nation building. And that quote was from Toyu Gyoten and Charles E. Morrison, Regionalism in a Converging World, New York Trilateral Commission, 1992, page 4, 7 to 9, and page 11. Applying the same perspective to the NAFTA treaty, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, CFR, said it is not a conventional trade agreement, but the architecture of a new international system, the vital first step for a new kind of community of nations. The newspaper article that contained this statement was appropriately entitled, "With NAFTA, U.S. finally creates a new world order." And that quote was from "With NAFTA, U.S. finally creates a new world order" by Henry Kissinger, Los Angeles Times, July 18, 1993, page M2 and 6. David Rockefeller, CFR, was even more emphatic. He said that it would be criminal not to pass the treaty because everything is in place after 500 years. Wow, 500 years. Can you believe that these people planned stuff like this for 500 years? That's incredible. Everything is in place after 500 years to build a new world in the Western Hemisphere. And that quote was from A Hemisphere in the Balance by David Rockefeller, Wall Street Journal, October 1st, 1993, page A10. By early 1994, the drift toward the New World Order had become a rush. On April 15th, the government of Morocco placed a full-page ad in the New York Times celebrating the creation of the World Trade Organization, which was formed by the signing of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT or GATT, which took place in the Moroccan city of Marrakech. While Americans were still being told that GATT was merely a trade agreement, the internationalists were celebrating a much larger concept. The ad spelled it out in unremarkable terms. That's where the propaganda begins, isn't it? 1994, Bretton Woods. 1944, Bretton Woods, the IMF and the World Bank. 1945, San Francisco, the United Nations. 1994, Marrakech, the World Trade Organization. History knows where it is going. The World Trade Organization, the third pillar of the New World Order, along with the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. These people dream big. You gotta give them that. That was from New York Times, April 15, 1994, page A9. A rare glimpse into inner workings. So much for the final play. Let us return now to the game called Bailout, as it is actually played today on the international international scene. Let us begin with a glimpse into the inner workings of the presidential cabinet. James Watt was the Secretary of the Interior in the Reagan administration. In his memoirs, he described an incident at the cabinet meeting in the spring of 1982. The first items on the agenda were reports by Treasury Secretary Donald Reagan and Budget Director David Stockman concerning problems with less developed countries were having with their bank loans. Watt said, Secretary Reagan was explaining the inability of those destitute countries to pay even the interest on the loans that individual banks such as Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, and Citibank had made. The president was being told what actions the United States must take to salvage the situation. After the Reagan and Stockman briefings, there were several minutes of discussion before I asked, does anyone believe that these less developed countries will ever be able to pay back the principal on these loans? When no one spoke up, I asked, if the loans are never going to be repaid, why should we again bail out the countries and arrange payment for their interest? The answer came from several voices at once. If we don't arrange for their interest payments, the loan will go into default, and it could put our American banks in jeopardy. Would the customers lose their money? No, came the answer, but the stockholders might lose dividends. In amazement, I leaned back in my large leather chair, only 2 seats from the President of the United States. I realized that nothing in the world could keep these high government officials from scrambling to protect and bail out a very few large and sorely troubled American banks. And that quote was from James G. Watt, The Courage of a Conservative, New York, Simon & Schuster, 1985, page 124 and 125. Panama. The first major score in the game had been made under the Carter administration when Panama fell in arrears on the payment of its loans. A consortium of banks, including Chase Manhattan, First National of Chicago, and Citibank, brought pressure to bear on Washington to give the canal to the Panamanian government so it could use the revenue to pay interest on its loans. Although there was massive opposition to this move among the American people, the Senate yielded to insider pressure and passed the Giveaway Treaty. Oh, was this the one where Panama was sold for $1? Oh, jeez. The Panamanian government inherited $120 million in annual revenue, and the interest payments to the banks were restored. As Congressman Philip Crane observed, at the time of the Torrijos-backed coup in 1968, Panama's total official overseas debt stood at a manageable and, by world standards, modest $167 million. That sounds like Trump change now. Now that we're looking at what's our debt now? 36 trillion or something? This is like nothing, 167 million. That's funny. Anyways, under Torrijos, indebtedness has skyrocketed nearly 1,000% to a massive $1.5 billion. Debt service ratio now consumes an estimated 39% of the entire Panamanian budget. What it appears we really have here is not just aid to a tin horn dictator in the form of new subsidies and canal revenues the treaties would give to the Torrijos regime, but a bailout of a number of banks, which should have known better than to invest in Panama, and in any event should not escape responsibility for having done so. And that quote was from Philip M. Crane. Surrender to Panama, Ottawa, Illinois, Caroline House Books, 1978, page 64 and 68. The Panama bailout was a unique play. In no other country did we have an income-producing property to give away. So from that point forward, the bailout would have to be done with mere money. To pave the way for that, the Congress passed the Monetary Control Act of 1980, which authorized the Federal Reserve to monetize foreign debt. That is banker language, meaning that the Fed was now authorized to create money out of nothing for the purpose of lending to foreign governments. It classifies those loans as assets and then uses them as collateral for the creation of even more money here in the United States. That was truly a revolutionary expansion of the Fed's power to inflate. Until then, it was permitted to make money only for the American government. Now it was able to do it for any government. Since then, it has been functioning as a central bank for the entire world. Mexico. By 1982, almost every third world government was running behind in payments. Mexico led the way by announcing it could not send any more money that year on its $85 billion debt. Federal Reserve Governor Henry Wallich rushed to Switzerland to negotiate an IMF loan of $4.5 billion through the Bank of International Settlements. The central banks of Europe and Japan provided $1.85 billion, about 40%. The rest came from the Federal Reserve. Commercial banks postponed payments on the principal for 2 years, but with the infusion of new loans, payment on the interest was resumed. That did not solve the problem. Within a few years, Mexico was in arrears again. And in 1985, the banks agreed to postpone $29 billion in payments and rolled over another $20 billion, which means they issued new loans to pay off the old. In that same year, Secretary of the Treasury, James Baker, announced the government's plan to solve the world's debt crisis. It was a formal statement encouraging banks to continue lending to third world governments, provided they promised to enact economic reforms favoring a free market. It was more of a philosophy than a plan, because there was no hope that it would be implemented by any of the socialist governments receiving the loans. Behind the announcement was the implication that the federal government, acting through the Federal Reserve System, could be counted on to assist if the loans went sour. Baker called for funneling $29 billion over 3 years, primarily to Latin American countries, of which Mexico was a prime recipient. Currency swap. Shortly after the Mexican government had loaned $55 million to Fidel Castro, it announced to the banks, "We will pay only what we have and no more." Whereupon Paul Volcker, head of the Federal Reserve, rushed to meet with Mexican's finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog, and offered to put the American taxpayer into the breach. A $600 million short-term loan was extended to get Mexico past its election date of July 4th. It was called a currency swap because Mexico exchanged an equal number of pesos, which it promised to redeem in US dollars. Pesos, of course, were worthless in international markets, which is the reason Mexico wanted the dollars. The importance of this loan was not its size or even the question of repayment. It was the manner in which it was made. First, it was made by the Federal Reserve directly, acting as a central bank for Mexico, not the US. And secondly, it was done almost in total secrecy. William Grider gives this details. The currency swaps had another advantage. They could be done secretly. Volcker discreetly informed both the administration and the key congressional chairman, and none objected. But the public reporting of currency swaps was required only every quarter, so the emergency loan from the Fed would not be disclosed for 3 or 4 months. By that time, Volcker hoped, Mexico would be arranging more substantial new financing from the IMF. The foreign assistance was done as discreetly as possible to avoid setting off a panic, but also to avoid domestic political controversy. Bailing out Mexico, it seemed, was too grave to be controversial. And that quote was from Grider, page 485, 486. Debt swap. The currency swap did not solve the problem. So in March of 1988, the players and referees agreed to introduce a new maneuver in the game, an accounting trick called a debt swap. A debt swap is similar to a currency swap in that the United States exchanges something of real value in turn for something that is worthless. But instead of currencies, they exchange government bonds. The transaction is complicated by the time value of those bonds. Currencies are valued by their immediate worth, what they will buy today, but bonds are valued by their future worth, what they will buy in the future. After that differential factor is calculated, the process is essentially the same. Here is how it worked. Mexico, using US dollars, purchased $492. Sorry, let me take a sip of my tea here. Okay, sorry about that. Let's start over. Mexico, using US dollars, purchased $492 million worth of American Treasury bonds that pay no interest, but which will pay $3.67 billion when they mature in 20 years. Technically, these are called zero coupon bonds. When Mexico issued its own bonds with the US securities tied to them as then Mexico issued its own bonds with the US securities tied to them as collateral. This meant that the future value of Mexico's bonds, previously considered worthless, were now guaranteed by the United States government. The banks eagerly swapped their old loans for these new Mexican bonds at a ratio of about 1.4 to 1. In other words, they accepted $100 million in bonds in return for canceling $140 million in old debt. That reduced their interest income, but they were happy to do it because they had swapped worthless loans for fully guaranteed bonds. This maneuver was hailed in the press as true monetary magic. Yeah, like sleight of hand magic, right? It would save the American government more than $200 million in annual interest charges. It would restore cash flow to the banks, and miracle of miracles, it would cost nothing to the American taxpayers. Yeah, right. And that was from U.S. bond issue will aid Mexico in paying debts by Tom Redburn. Los Angeles Times, December 30th, 1987. The reasoning was that the treasury bonds were sold at normal market rates. The Mexican government paid as much for them as anyone else. That part was true. But what the commentators failed to notice was where Mexico got the American dollars with which to buy the bonds. They came through the IMF in the form of foreign currency exchange reserves. In other words, they were subsidies from the industrialized nations, primarily the United States. So the US Treasury put up the lion's share of the money to buy its own bonds. It went $500 million deeper in debt and agreed to pay $3.7 billion more in future payments. So the American government, so the Mexican government could continue paying interest to the banks. That is called bailout, but it does fall on the American taxpayer. Wow. Okay, we will stop here for now. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I hope you guys join us next week for part 2. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.